We are getting some political news, this involving presidential candidate Donald Trump, saying that he has picked his vice presidential candidate. He has selected JD Vance, the senator from Ohio, as his running mate. Of course, the RNC convention, the Republican National Convention, kicking off in Milwaukee today. Trump's scheduled to speak several times during this event, but of course, the main event will come on Thursday, of course, with his formal nomination and the unveiling of his vice president pick, Alex. JD Vance, the Ohio senator, now selected to be Donald Trump's running mate.
Yes, and it was quite interesting in terms of the tone then, because JD Vance over the last couple of days has come out and talked to, and blamed the Democrats as well as President Biden for the attempted assassination of President Trump versus President Trump's own rhetoric, which has just been much more around unity. And so you have to wonder then, does the campaign stay with unity, or does it continue to fracture, or does it do both?
I think we're going to find that out in a big way over the next 3 or 4 days, depending on the rhetoric. It also gets to the idea, too. I mean, a lot of presidents, of course, pick a running mate who can actually deliver votes as well. That's a big part of why you pick him. Obviously, he represents Ohio, obviously a very important state. If you want to get elected in this country, you pretty much have to win Ohio, and maybe JD Vance can deliver that for him.
Yeah, and also when you take a look at, say, who's going to decide the election, as you point out, I think I read a great stat over the weekend that's, 6% of people in 6 states. And Ohio, as we know, is one of those states. And as Romain was just mentioning, that breaking news that JD Vance will now be former President Trump VP pick as the senator from Ohio. We'll see if there's a market reaction. We'll see how we wind up taking that, and we'll see how the rhetoric continues over the RNC over the next 4 days.
I am curious, though, too. I mean, we talk about sort of how we got to this point. I mean, obviously, Marco Rubio's name was floated out there from Florida. I think Nikki Haley was kind of briefly, and a couple other folks here. And it gets to the question as to why you select someone like JD Vance. There was a lot of talk that maybe Trump might want to go for a woman, or might want to go from a state that maybe he couldn't carry on his own as a way of, say, maybe blunting the impact of Biden. But obviously, we know Vance has had a pretty remarkable rise from, of course, his book was A Hillbilly Elegy, and of course, the movie coming out of that, writing that to the U.S. Senate, and now potentially writing that all the way to the executive office right across from the White House.
There was some narrative over the last 24 hours that potentially Nikki Haley could be more of the front runner for VP, or just in the race again in a way that she might not have been before for vice president. Again, to circle back to that message more of unity and coming together versus more polarizing conversation, which again is what we heard from JD Vance over the weekend. So it will be interesting to see how, again, that evolves over the next few days.
I'm also interested in seeing the polling as well, kind of like how these two together stacks up against presumably Biden-Harris, although we know that's still potentially up in the air as to who that duo might actually be, but to see how they stack up against each other. Once again, the breaking news right now, former President Donald Trump, the presumptive front runner, the presumptive nominee, I should say, for the Republican Party's presidential ticket, has now selected his running mate, JD Vance, the senator from Ohio. Let's go out to Kailey Leinz, who I believe is on the ground out there in Milwaukee for our co-host of Balance of Power. Kailey, I guess this isn't a surprise. We've seen JD Vance's name really start to bubble up over the past few weeks and months here. What does a Vance-Trump ticket bring to this that a different running mate would not have?
Well, in selecting Senator JD Vance, Romain, in some ways, Donald Trump is selecting the vice president most like him. JD Vance, of course, relatively new in the U.S. Senate. He was only elected in 2022, began his term in January of last year, is a populist. He very much espouses a lot of the populist rhetoric that we hear from Donald Trump. Of course, his best-selling memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, which came out in the aftermath of Trump's election, many saw as something that explained how the Trump effect happened in America, as he grew up in a manufacturing town in Ohio, where his family was plagued by issues of drug addiction and just a lower income existence in which he saw many people around him struggling. And so that populist aspect is really what JD Vance is going to be bringing to this ticket. In many ways, JD Vance would be the most direct continuation of potentially of a Donald Trump presidency as vice president, if he ever did indeed need to ascend to the presidency. JD Vance, of course, sits on the Senate Banking Committee. He has a history in technology, specifically on the West Coast close associations with Peter Thiel, who helped fund one of JD Vance's venture firms when he was a venture capitalist still before he began his political career. So this is someone with close business ties, with access to money, which is important, and of who, of course, exposes a lot of the values that we hear Donald Trump talking a lot about.
Kailey, can you walk us through a little bit about what this process was like to get to the decision of JD Vance?
It was extended, and Donald Trump wanted it to be so. He had, in just recent days, described this as a highly sophisticated version of The Apprentice. He had made it known that he wanted to announce this here at the convention, not let it leak out beforehand, as he thought it would improve ratings and excitement. This was an extensive process. The list went from being potentially dozens long down to what we understood was JD Vance, Marco Rubio, and Doug Burgum. Obviously, those last two have been informed they are not the vice presidential selection, but Donald Trump really did take his time with this. And we all had this question of whether or not the events of this weekend, the attempted assassination at that rally in Pennsylvania on Saturday, might actually change the former president's choice, in that he was very much faced with his own mortality. He says that he's now going to be talking much more about unity. And frankly, JD Vance, the senator from Ohio, is not necessarily who you might think would be the unity vice presidential candidate, as he has been known to be an attack dog for former President Trump. Yeah. He is very comfortable in front of cameras, protecting Donald Trump and being quite aggressive. And some thought that Donald Trump might not be making that kind of selection in the aftermath of the events of the last 48 hours.
Yeah, and it's interesting, too. I mean, we should point out there were a couple of social media posts by JD Vance that were far from a unifying message in the wake of that assassination attempt of Donald Trump. I am curious here, Kailey, that once we do actually see these two men together, obviously this week at RNC, but more importantly on the campaign trail after that, are the similarities between them, are they too close? Did he need to maybe pick somebody who provided variance, or is that not going to matter for the voters?
Well, it's such an interesting question, Ramin, because you're exactly right. In Senator JD Vance, he is not only picking another populist, but another white man, granted one who is significantly younger than him right now. Senator Vance is only 39. He turns 40 in August, so in some ways he is the newer version of Donald Trump, if you will, but he doesn't necessarily appeal to any specific demographic that Donald Trump wasn't already appealing to when it comes to his base. He obviously is not a person of color. He is a man. Those were kind of the decisions we thought might inform Donald Trump's vice presidential selection. And I would also point out that this selection was made, this ticket, what will be Trump and Vance 2024, has likely been pulled against just a Biden-Harris ticket, what we have understood the Democratic ticket would be. And for all of the events of the last several days, which have taken kind of oxygen away from the conversation about whether Joe Biden will be continuing forward as the Democratic nominee, it is worth considering how a Trump-Vance ticket may counter another ticket if we don't see Joe Biden leading that, though, of course, Joe Biden is maintaining he is staying in this race.